Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be able to join you for this important day, and congratulations to all those who have been involved in its organisation. Last night I hosted an event for the British Career Society, and one of the authors of a new book is sitting here, and she spoke along with her co-author, Timothy, who we'll be hearing from later on, was there too, and one or two others I can see here today. It was an indication of the kind of things that the All-Party Parliamentary Group on North Korea has been involved in over the years. And I, as one of the co-founders of that group with my close and good friend Baroness Cox, Caroline Cox, have really been delighted to see how the group is able to continue and to function despite all the antagonism that we often have from the authorities in Pyongyang for its work. We didn't form it as a, inverted commas, friendship group of fellow travellers. There are plenty of those in Parliament. This was formed as a group that would uphold human rights and would insist that we take the security challenges from North Korea seriously. And so we've done that, I hope, intelligently and in a bipartisan and bicameral way across Parliament over the years that have followed. And for me, these days, it's wonderful to co-chair this group with Fiona Bruce, who we heard from in her wonderful address earlier on, and to know that all of us are really singing from the same hymn sheet, that we're all trying to move the situation on, that we haven't forgotten what is taking place and happening in North Korea. Sometimes you wonder whether anyone is taking any notice, and I was recently actually amused but also encouraged when attending an international meeting, someone got up and said, and I knew who he was, so I was slightly surprised when I saw him there. He got up and said, he said, was Lord Alton's spy. And this was Mr. Tae, who was the number 2 in the North Korean embassy in Britain. And he had the unfortunate job, he explained to the meeting, of having to monitor all of my speeches, all of my parliamentary questions. I thought, well, goodness, I'm glad someone was reading them. So I did find that encouraging. He had to send them all back to Pyongyang. This led to the point where he and the ambassador were told to come and give me a lecture on why I had to desist in doing this. And I sat here in Parliament over a cup of coffee while a monologue, a diatribe, was read out to me. Even the ambassador became a bit, I think, bored by what he was reading out. And in the end, he said, we hate you. This was his summary. And at the end, I said, but Ambassador, I love you. It's just your system and your ideology and the things you do, the brutal things to your own people that I hate and that one day I hope will change. As we were walking down to leave the building, he looked over to see if his number 2 was listening, and there was a space between us, and he just put his hand out to me and said, no hard feelings. And I sort of inwardly laughed, and I thought, hopefully he knows that this is a ludicrous thing to be coming in here and saying, we're now, as far as we're concerned, you're a non-person, you don't exist, and we will have no more to do with you because you insist on raising these human rights questions. But if you trace back the antecedents of this APPG, that was the agreement right from the start, that we would not be willing to travel to North Korea, as I did on 4 occasions. We would not be willing to have a role of being a sort of interlocutor with the government unless we could raise human rights issues. And in those early days, that was a given. Now, one of the things the group did, and Fiona Bruce alluded to this, was to present evidence to Michael Kirby when he was conducting his inquiry on behalf of the United Nations, the Commission of Inquiry. And over the distance, we had held hearings here at Westminster where escapees had been able to come and give their evidence and tell us about the terrible things that had happened to them. Some of them had been in some of the prison camps. Michael Kirby's report to the United Nations said that he had identified, in a technical and legal sense, crimes against humanity. And when it came to Christians and specific religious minorities, he said he didn't have enough evidence to call it genocide, but he was leaving that as an open question. And in a new book, which Dr. Evelina Rochav and I have just published on genocide, we have a section on North Korea and examine the evidence that was placed before Michael Kirby. And he is as deeply frustrated, wonderful Australian judge, eminent jurist, he's as frustrated as many of us are here, that all the attempts that are made to try and bring this to the Security Council and to force China to veto it, to flush them out, to show that because that's the excuse that's always given for it never being taken to the Security Council. It's been my long-held belief that even if it is vetoed by them, it is better for us to put that report on the table and say, you, the United Nations, commissioned this report. It found that there were crimes against humanity, that there might even be genocide, and we can't even get the referral that the Commission of Inquiry said should be made to the International Criminal Court. And I think we must, whatever recommendations come out of this event today, I hope that we will consider again how we can be more effective in ensuring that the testimonies, the evidence, the accounts that we hear, that we can do something rather more effective than we've done hitherto. Now, the panel today, let me introduce the three of them, and then we will move to some questions. Timothy Cho, he walked into my university office some years ago. My secretary was slightly alarmed and said, there's a North Korean in the reception, David. And it was Timothy who told me about not one, but two escapes he tried to make from North Korea and the torture he'd received there. And I was very proud when I saw Timothy as the time went by, because I said to him, well, what is it you want? And he said, I want to learn about international affairs and politics, and one day to do something for my country. And I was very proud as I saw Timothy get his degree, and then his master's degree from Liverpool University, and the role that he's been playing in promoting human rights, and particularly freedom of religion or belief. He first escaped from North Korea to China when he was age 17, forcibly repatriated, arbitrarily detained and tortured, and he later successfully escaped North Korea and found refuge, as several hundred North Koreans have done in the United Kingdom. He became an aide to Fiona Bruce, Member of Parliament, where he learned about politics and went out on the campaign trail, and anyone who was silly enough to say that they were thinking of not voting, he would give them a lecture on how fortunate they were to have a vote and all the freedoms and privileges that we enjoy in this country. And he's also acted as an inquiry clerk to our all-party parliamentary group, and he stood for election in the English local elections in May of this year. Suyeon is a co-director of Korea Future. She's led the organization's work documenting violations of religion or belief in North Korea, and is a leading voice on the abuses experienced by religious minorities in North Korea. She has several years of experience working in North Korean human rights and maintains strong connections with the North Korean diaspora. And she's recently presented evidence to the European Parliament, the United Nations, and to our all-party parliamentary group. Undergirding everything that she and the others will say is a commitment to Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Sometimes this is regarded, we've used the phrase before, an orphaned right. It is one of the 30 articles. It insists that everyone, every human being, has the right to believe, not to believe, or to change their belief. So this isn't just a nice to have. This is one of the 30 articles of the Universal Declaration. Then there's Vija Herefoss, who's a senior advisor at the International Department of Stefanus Alliance International in Norway. She specializes in the intersection between gender and freedom of religion or belief. And in 2021, she co-authored a learning resource, Freedom of Religion or Belief for Everyone, Women in Focus. And I was very struck at one of our meetings, a man who is now a minister in the Foreign Office, in the FCDO, came to a meeting where we had an extraordinary woman who came and gave evidence to us. And I know he told me afterwards how deeply moved he had been, I'm talking about Lord Goldsmith, Zach Goldsmith, by the evidence that that woman gave about her experiences in the prison camps. And I don't think we should ever underestimate the indescribable things that have happened to people, but to women in particular. So Vija's presented on the topic at international conferences, was part of an international reference group reviewing online learning materials on gender and for the NOR4 learning platform, which is funded by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I think I'll go back to my seat, and I'm then going to put some questions to Timothy, and we'll then move on. And I'm told we've got plenty of time until 11:25. So once we've gone through the questions that we've alerted the panel to, I'll open the floor to anybody else who would like to go and ask questions. Thank you. So, Timothy, I think we can stay seated. Can you tell us, first of all, about the persecution that you experienced inside North Korea? And then I've got two other questions to you, so keep it brief.
Thank you, Lord Alton and Fiona Bruce MP, and the South Korea Human Rights Commission. I'm very grateful having this opportunity. I remember the man who leaned on my back died in prison cell, in North Korean prison cell. And his dead body was dragged out of the cell like a dead animal. And his blood was left on my shirt, and it never runs away. I remember the man was executed in front of my eyes. I was just about 11-year-old. And I collected the 2 bullet shells after the execution was done. And I thought it was normal. I remember living on the street, and I saw many dead bodies of starvation. We have a number of North Korean escapees out here. You can ask them, have you ever seen any dead bodies of starvation? They could say yes without hesitation, including those who I lived with on the street together. I remember I knelt and desperately asked God for freedom in the darkest Shanghai International Prison cell, because my second repatriation expected to be executed publicly. And I remember during my settlement in the UK, I was hiding under the desk after I read about torture and prison, the documents. And these flashbacks and nightmares are still there, not far away. It's not just me. I think who will hear from Suyeon Park, another North Korean escapee, would also share a similar story of what we are going through. And all this suffering, pain, and persecution, and it's still there. It's still in my eyes. You can still hear it. You can still hear the torture and screaming of my inmates, what was happening in North Korean prison cell. And I still see that I was screaming out and begging out and calling God at the Mongolian border during my escape. I was severely brainwashed and indoctrinated about anti-Christianity in North Korea. We meant to not follow. We meant to not have any practice of freedom of faith. And that practice, love, faith, and humanity in the name of love. But that was not possible in North Korea. The man who I mentioned executed publicly, and his crime was because he helped 4 North Korean women to go to church in China. And I didn't know what church it was that time. And that religious persecution was there, and it is still there, and it will be there tomorrow. When there is no freedom of religion, it means there is no freedom at all, which coincide 70 years deep and darkness, totalitarian system continues in North Korea. The other day, I was having spaghetti dinner with my family, and I can cook spaghetti well. And I saw my 4-year-old daughter, Christina, was eating so happily. All of a sudden, watching my daughters eating dinner so happily, I was in tears. And I was whispering, thank God. And I was asking him at the same time, can I be happy? It is something every time you watch, read, and you hear about it, this is a reminder of what was happening in North Korea, what is right now happening in North Korea, what is going to happen. So this event, and it's not something about just about persecution, but it is upon these millions of people who are persecuted right now, tortured, imprisoned, and killed. And every single event we are having, APP's North Korea have, and on North Korea, it is upon their persecution story and pain and suffering. And we know this. North Korea is the largest prison cell and one of the longest totalitarian regimes in the world. And that persecution, and not just about in the past 20 years, what we see on the report, but it's been there for over 70 years. And here I reflect and testify myself, and in this room, it's a story of what I experienced, what we experienced, what is right now they experience. And it is still there. And that's what I call it is a persecution and pain and suffering.
Timothy, thank you very much for that. I've got some questions, but I'll come back to those later on if I may, because I'd like to introduce now Suyeon Yu to say something about, give us your presentation about the background, but specifically as well, would you reference, how things may have changed since Kim Jong-un came to power? Is the trajectory better? Is it worse? Perhaps you could reference that as well in your remarks.
Thank you. Actually, I've prepared the slides for everyone.
Yep.
So
Great. Perhaps we can turn around and see them then.
Good morning. I'm Suyeon Yu. I'm co-director at Korea Future. Firstly, I'd like to thank co-host of today's event, All-Party Parliamentary Group on North Korea and the National Human Rights Commission of Korea. And it's a pleasure to have this chance to address about this religious freedom violations in North Korea here in person. And today I'll be explaining the critical linkage between the persecution of religion and belief in North Korea on the one hand, and the indoctrination of Kim Il-sungism in North Korea on the other hand. And this is based on our findings from over 3 years of dedicated investigation into religious freedom violations in North Korea. And it's, I think, the most important understanding for policymakers, justice actors, and CSOs of why religious groups have been exterminated and continue to be persecuted in the country. We are proud to have investigated and documented some of the most comprehensive evidence on religious freedom violations in North Korea. And as you can see from the slides, we have released 8 reports on religious freedom in North Korea in the past 3 years. And we also run a dedicated online database for religious freedom violations called the North Korean Religious Freedom Database, which gives open access to data from over 1,000 individual cases of religious freedom violations in North Korea, documented by our investigators in over 400 interviews with survivors, witnesses, and perpetrators. We research religious freedom violation for 2 simple reasons. First, we fundamentally believe that the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion is a universal and fundamental human right. Universal in that it provides all individuals with the same right to adopt, not to adopt, and to renounce or change your religion or belief, as Lord Alton briefly mentioned in the beginning, and also fundamental in that it offers these same protections to all human beings. And this is as much about protecting a right not to believe as it is about a right to believe, as my presentation will demonstrate. Second, we identified a very real need for credible and verifiable information, both through careful investigations that could stand up in a future court of law. While many have known the broad strokes of religious persecution, this was not enough for justice to be realized, and justice actors need more. Our investigation did not focus on any one specific religion or belief. However, almost in all cases, we documented how violations were perpetrated against 2 particular religious groups, which are North Korean shamanism and Christianity. The figure shows the number of victims of each religion in our database. And our evidence tells us that followers of these religions and belief groups are being targeted with the listed violations on the slide. And we have hundreds of interviews documenting these acts. in detail alongside their perpetrators, which is suggestive of an institutionalized and well thought out policy. North Korea is run by Workers' Party of Korea, and this is correct term rather than government or regime, because the party controls every state entity and agents, making them its implementing arms. In turn, the persecution of religious groups is overseen by the Workers' Party and made possible by the active mobilization of every state organization, in particular the Ministry of State Security, who I refer as MSS, and MSS plays a central role in monitoring activities and persons related to Christianity, and the Ministry of People Security, or MPS, who take precedence over shamanic cases. And just for your information, we refer the Ministry of Social Security by its old name, which is the Ministry of People Security, to avoid any confusion with Ministry of State Security. And the MPS is similar to a national police force in the other nations, but it serves a party political function in North Korea due to it being subject to Workers' Party's control and its mission of upholding the political system. And its enforcement activities fall under the euphemistic term superstitions, and this term encompasses religious and belief practices and commonly refers to shamanism. The MSS officials' mission is to protect the Kim family and the political system by uncovering hostile forces engaged in espionage, anti-party or anti-revolutionary activities. And to carry out its operations, the MSS maintains branches throughout North Korea. And as an intelligence agency, it carries out many of its operations in secret, and its officers do not wear a uniform in public. And individuals released from MSS custody are made to stamp their fingerprints on a form stating that upon release, they will not speak about their experiences. Since the 1950s, Protestantism has been the most severely persecuted religious tradition within North Korea, and Catholicism was exterminated in its entirety very early in the rule of Workers' Party. And over the past 70 years, the Workers' Party, under 3 successive members of the Kim family, all of whom are men, have perfected a system of continuous monitoring of citizens, repressive anti-religious legislation, directives, education, and propaganda, enabled and devoted huge state resources to state entities and state agents whose tasks are to uncover and remove Christians from society. Built a system whereby informants are coerced and blackmailed into providing information on suspected religious persons, and performed public acts of violence that have, when taken together, decimated a once populous Protestant community. And in our interviews with self-identifying Christians who have escaped North Korea, and speaking with partners who facilitated their escape, we documented how religious practices of Christians now largely consist of private prayers, proselytization to immediate family members, and attendance of religious ceremonies outside of North Korean territory, mainly in China, after adherents illegally crossed the border. Now, underground churches do exist, but our investigation found that it's found to be very rare, according to our investigation. And proselytization, which is an Article 18 right, directed towards individuals who are not immediate family members, is extremely rare because both the MPS and MSS maintain cover involvement networks that actively gather information and report on religious activities both in China and in North Korea. In our work reviewing state documents and interviewing former state agents, it was very clear that Christian practices are considered by the ruling Workers' Party to be anti-party, anti-state activities that can bring the collapse of North Korea's ideology, the Kim family, and the ruling structures, meaning that to practice one's right to religious freedom as a Christian is considered an anti-state and political crime. In terms of responsibility, we documented the MSS being responsible for 90% of human rights violations perpetrated against Christians. And as an intelligence agency, the MSS carried out many of its operations in secret, including extrajudicial executions, following in-camera trials, and it maintains its own penal facilities, prosecution department, and court system, including North Korea's political prison camps. And this political prison camps is maintained by MSS Foreign Management Bureau. And the reason why it's called Foreign Management Bureau, which seems although it seems irrelevant to political prison camps, is because the Workers' Party of Korea does not acknowledge the existence of political prison camps in public. And shamanism is the most widespread belief system in North Korea. It's officially banned, but it's tied to normative beliefs and customs in North Korea, and it's therefore seen as a lesser but still significant threat to the legitimacy of the regime's ideology. Shamans are commonly referred to as fortune tellers, and we documented people visiting them for various reasons, ranging from obtaining divinations to procuring magical healing. And shamanism rose to become an essential component of North Korean society following the collapse of the country's economy in the 1990s, a period of famine and financial hardship known as the Arduous March. It's common for shamans to live in destitution and in hiding from NPS law enforcement officials, because once they are arrested, they will be subject to physical search, and they are also compelled to undertake forced labor without trial. And those who did not stand trial were commonly subject to administrative rather than criminal punishment. The Workers' Party of Korea, North Korea, periodically undertakes crackdowns incited by anti-religious policies and directives that bring together many different state entities to hunt down and detain shamanic adherents. And if there's one key point to take from our research, it is that religious persecution results from the implementation of the Workers' Party's core mission rather than the enforcement of a criminal code. Anything seen to incite or encourage a break from national ideological unity is considered a threat to the political system that must be exterminated. And this is an immovable and unbreakable pillar in the rule of the Kim dynasty. And we refer to this monolithic ideology as Kim Il-sungism and Kim Jong-ilism. And there exists a zero-sum relationship between Kim Jong-ilism and Kim Il-sungism, Kim Jong-ilism, and all other religions and beliefs for one region. And that's adherence to this ideology means the renunciation of all other systems of religion or belief. The ideology states that one cannot believe in the Kims and another God or belief system. Any devotion to an alternative belief system, whether it is Christianity or shamanism, is regarded as an act of treason and one that deserves the most severe of punishments. And how do we come to this conclusion when the North Korean Constitution guarantees the right to freedom of religion or belief? Firstly, through hundreds of interviews with survivors and witnesses, but also by speaking with former North Korean officials, sourcing internal party documents, and interviewing perpetrators. For example, we sourced internal legal commentaries of 2018 Constitution and the 2018 Criminal Code. Both were printed by the Workers' Party specifically for legal practitioners. And this shows one of the documents. And as you can see, the Constitution commentary tells the legal practitioners that workers and young people do not believe in any religion because they deeply understand the profound truth of the Juche ideology, and that's written in the document. And in reference to Christianity, the commentary then states that American imperialists have used religion as a tool to invade our country. They are viciously plotting to spread religion, to paralyze class consciousness and revolutionary consciousness of the people and crush our republic. And also, this criminal code commentary defines shamanism as crime of superstition. More recently, the reactionary ideology and cultural rejection law, which is stated on the bottom of the slide, was enacted in December 2020 during the height of the pandemic and was recently revised in last August. And this states that individuals who engage with shamanic materials are to be sentenced to between 5 to 15 years of re-education or a life sentence under its Article 29, and those who produce and distribute these materials are subject to execution. So this is the result if you do not believe in the Kim ideology. And this shows some of the documented cases of torture when we interviewed those people who are associated with religion. And you can see beatings with fists and feet, beatings with objects, positional torture, and the ingestion of polluted food, among many other violations of international law and standards of detention. So to wrap up, I'd like to say that while religious freedom is certainly a challenging area to research, it is critical to understanding the regime, its capacity, but also its fundamental weakness. The Workers' Party devotes such massive resources to the promotion and protection of Kim Il-sungism, Kim Jong-ilism, and the destruction of shamanism and Christianity, not because it's strong, but because it understands its own fundamental weakness. I often say that human rights violations prosper in the shadows, and this has been the case with religious freedom violations in North Korea. But now our work shines light on these violations, the victims and the perpetrators. And thank you for listening to my presentation. And just to answer briefly on your question on the trends of the religious freedom violations in North Korea, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the persecutions on shamans has been very strengthened, because we've documented some cases related to public executions on shamans, which hasn't been reported as often before 2019. And I think that that's a clear indication how things worsened in North Korea, and also shows the Workers' Party of Korea's position on that. So thank you.
Suyeon, thank you very much indeed for the way in which you presented to us, but also for answering that question as well. And there will be other questions, we'll come back to that in due course. Now my pleasure to hand the floor to Vija, who's going to talk to us about the gender-related issues connected to freedom of religion or belief. And indeed, last year, the all-party parliamentary group on FORB, of which I'm a vice chair, produced a report on trends where we actually did identify this as an issue that we believed was important to study, to have cognizance of, and to act on as well. So perhaps in your presentation you might make some reference to some of the remarks that were in that report and the recommendations that we made. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. So as just mentioned, I have been asked to join this panel, not primarily as an expert in human rights violations in North Korea, but somebody who has worked extensively in this intersection between gender and FORB. And I think for those of you who have worked with North Korea, you would be very clear over the fact that there is a very clear gender perspective in human rights violations in general, but also those related to FORB violations. And as a preparation for this presentation, I looked at your report, Korea Future Report from 2021 on FORB violations. And what did I find? I find that 272 of the interviewees were women, while there were 71 men. And I'm not trying to accuse you of gender bias here, but I think this sort of dynamic shows actually the actual numbers, both of women who cross voluntarily or involuntarily into China, and sometimes also onwards, but also that one of the conclusions that you make in that report is that majority of those who actually do practice religion, whether it's Christianity or shamanism, are women. So as I said, the gender perspective is absolutely there. And another wonderful comment that you make in your other report on North Korean women as beacons of resistance is that they are not only undertaking massive risks in practicing, and it's also sometimes sharing their religions, but also they are actually active agents. So because I think sometimes in our FORB violations we have a lot of focus on victims, and that is a very legitimate focus, and I'm not saying you shouldn't focus on it, but I think it's equally important to remember that at least these women, they are not just victims, they are survivors, they are very active agents of change. As I understood from your research, also some of those who become Christians also become leaders of their own little house communities. And again, majority of those are women. So we see a very clear gender perspective. So if the data is so clear on the fact that gender is an important factor in it, why is it so that, in my experience, there is still this approach of linking together gender and FORB is still quite new? There has been some attempts to actually integrate those two things. Some of the UN special rapporteurs in freedom of religion and belief have tried to include it in their reports, but it is still far from being mainstreamed. And I would like to, through this presentation, also challenge you a little bit on that particular issue. So first and foremost, the question is why has it not been mainstreamed? And I think there is an unfortunate lack of a good dialogue between those who are interested in forward issues and those who are interested in gender equality issues. And both of these, if we could call them parties, have their own prejudices against each other. When we look at the forum experts, very often we still see that a lot of reporting, analysis, also suggestions for activities that could be done to counter forum violations are gender blind. And I don't think there is necessarily an ill will in it. I think it's more the lack of awareness. And also the question is, whom do we talk? Because very often when it comes to religious communities, it is the leaders that are sought out. And who are the leaders of different religious communities? It's mainly men. So you talk to men, and as we have seen through the history of humanity, usually the men's experience is the default. So there are rarely questions asked if the things that these leaders report as the main challenges and the best solutions actually also represent the voices of women. And also, in my experience, when we talk about forum violations or try to document them and record them, we very often tend to focus on that which is visible. And usually it is the violations that happen against men that are visible. One of the major areas of forum violations, which we see not just in North Korea but globally, is sexual violence. And as you might know, sexual violence is one of those types of violence which is notoriously difficult to report, because very often the victims themselves do not want to talk about it. But if it is not reported, it doesn't mean there is no data, it means it doesn't exist, although we do know it exists. So that is some of the weaknesses that we find in what we could call the forum camp. And when we look at the gender activists, we see that very often there is a misunderstanding what forum is all about. Forum is seen primarily as a right that defends or even justifies discrimination of women or even harmful treatment of women. And this stems from the misunderstanding that forum defends religions. Forum does not defend religions, it defends individuals. And also what we find sometimes in the gender activists is that there is overarchingly negative idea of what religion is. And that religion can only play a negative role in women's lives, and that means that freedom means freedom from religion. But when we look at the lived realities of women, for many women actually religion is a source of hope, is a source of strength, is a hope of meaning, is a source of survival. And one last thing that we also see, that sometimes human rights are seen as a zero-sum game. If you have one right, which means you have to give up on the other one. So you can't have both freedom of religion belief and gender equality. There is a sort of a, if you take more of one, you're going to get less of the other one. So why is it important then to have the integrated approach? First of all, what we have learned from our work is that forum violations are always gendered. They are always playing out differently for men and women. There are different methods used, there are different consequences, and there is different needs for different type of resolutions to actually address these. As I mentioned before, also we need to see human beings as more complex. It's not just that they want to have one right. Usually they want to have more rights. And when we make them to choose which right they should have, I think we are not taking into consideration the complexity of human existence. Third, we have to remind ourselves that all human rights are indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. And I think this is the point that we sometimes tend to forget. We look at the human rights at those 30 articles like a menu. Okay, we pick those and those, but we will leave out those and those. But the moment you take out one, the whole house falls together. So one breach of one right means automatically breach of others. Strengthening of one right also means strengthening of the other ones. And also, of course, we want to have this focus on women as agents. They're not only victims, they are strong, they are resilient, they are resourceful, so this is another important aspect that we have. So I want to leave you with 3 challenges. When it comes to North Korean context, the first one is how much do we actually know and understand about this intersectionality of discrimination, because women usually experience double and triple discrimination on the basis of their gender, on the basis of their religious belief or belonging, on the basis of their social status. It can also be ethnicity, you name it. So there are certain several layers there, and all of these interact with each other. So that is my first question. How much do we know about how North Koreans experience all these different layers of discrimination? The second one, what does justice look like for North Korean women? Does it look the same way as it does for North Korean men? Or are there other things that need to happen for women to experience that they have received justice? And lastly, I think there is definitely a necessity for more research on how women actually navigate these very, very limited spaces, like, for example, North Korean society. How do they navigate and how do they move under the radar and actually manage to be leaders of small house churches, practicing shamanism? And one of the things that we see that in a way they use in their own benefit, the fact that women have a low social status. They are not important. They are not so important to observe or pay attention. So they actually use it in their own benefit to use that space. And I think this is a very interesting conclusion that you made in your reports. And I think I would very much encourage to do more research on how exactly in these very limited spaces women actually manage to navigate and find space for agency. That could, I hope, in the future bring also a larger change and transformation in society. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I think you'd agree we've had three superb presentations to set the scene for us. This intersectionality between human rights is something that's always interested me, and how you can constructively encourage people to see that these are not polarities that are in competition with one another, but somehow they must stand together and stand for the importance of the generality of human rights as well as the distinctive things that they care about from where they're coming from. And we mustn't compromise individuals because of the motives that they have to engage in human rights, but they must see the broader picture as well. And certainly those who were drafting the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights saw it that way, and so should we. I mentioned earlier on the lady who came and gave evidence on one occasion, Hei Wu. It was an extraordinary meeting, and it did profoundly affect those who were present, not least because of some of the specifics that she described about what had happened to her as a woman. So it wasn't just the horror of torture and humiliation and the aggression that there had been. It was the specifics about what had happened to her for the reasons of her gender. And indeed there were other women who have given evidence to the All-Party Group over the years. I remember one woman who spoke in the Moses Room and over in the palace itself and told us about how she said these were her words, they tortured the Christians the most. She said, but then she talked about some of the sexual violations that you've just referred to, which were specific to women. And of course Michael Kirby in his report brings out things like the forced abortion of women, for instance, being sterilised and aborted because they became pregnant while they were working, trying to eke out a livelihood and money for food in China, and then returning pregnant to North Korea and then being subjected to this other gross violation of their human rights. So the intersectionality of these things is something that you're absolutely right, we must do more about. And of course, the whole purpose of this seminar and these events today is to give some focus to that.